We are very honored today to have Professor Ali Argan join us, one of the longtime collaborators with Professor Cohen and a very strong member of our polymer community. And I'm going to turn things over to Professor Argan now.
Now you said almost half of the things I was already going to say. At any rate, I'm delighted to see so many friends here. You know, friends that haven't changed much and friends who have changed a great deal. So we have to introduce each other to each other. Well, I'm here for a very special reason, like all of you are. We want to honor Bob Cohen, our dear friend Bob Cohen. And I met Bob in 1973, many years ago. 1973, I took a sabbatical leave in England at Leeds University with my friend Ian Ward, and I had a Science Research Council fellowship. The fellowship required that I visit practically all, or as many as possible, polymer centers in the UK. I would have done it anyway, but so when I visited Oxford University to visit my friend McCrum, Reeds and Williams, their famous book. Well, Gary McCrum was very kind to me, as usual, and he introduced me to a young visitor there by the name of Robert Cohen. That's the time that I met Robert Cohen, so in 1973, so you make the subtraction more than 40 years ago. And Bob Cohen at that time told me that he was going to join MIT, and I said, what a wonderful thing, because I need a co-worker. And so since that time, not exactly from 1973, because we had to come back here and he did what he did, but we had a collaboration, a most prolific collaboration with Bob Cohen. And Cohen has been the most engaging collaborator. In the year 2010, I thought I owe it to my collaborators to write a book about all these wonderful things that we did. So I published a book with Cambridge University Press in 1913, which is called Physics of Deformation and Fracture of Polymers. Now, all of you, not all of you, but some of you who worked with me are cited in that book because my goal was to honor all my collaborators, among whom the principal collaborator was Bob Cohen. Bob Cohen, at the author index, is the most cited collaborator. Of course, the biggest cited person was myself. but Bob Cohen and I collaborated on countless papers, on work that we did with graduate students, on work which we did with visiting Polish scientist friends and so on, and all of those collaborations produced some beautiful results. And those are all explained in some form in that book of mine. Well, in the early 1960s, when I came to MIT, I listened to some lectures by John Slater in this famous room 6120 on quantum mechanics of materials. And I thought, what a wonderful thing. Maybe one day I could lecture in this room too. Never occurred to me, but no, I'm not going to lecture, just say a few words. And the few words that I'm going to say, I've already said. So I just wish the very best to my friend Bob Cohen, many years to come. And we don't actively collaborate anymore. But I learned many things from Bob Cohen, as I did from many of my other collaborators, Orhan were not always smiling there. And of course, we had engaging collaborations. Well, enough said, but I'm delighted to be here to honor my friend and collaborators, Bob Cohen. wonderful person he is, as you know.
Thank you, Ali.
Excellent. Our next speaker this afternoon is Frank Bates. And Frank is the person who originated the synthetic phase.
Put it on.
And I will turn things over to Frank.
Great. Thank you. What a pleasure. Thanks, Dayon. Fantastic organization. This is a great pleasure for me to be able to join you in honoring Bob for a lifetime of achievements and terrific collaboration. I'm going to walk you through a story about how I got here and how the work I've done in my most recent past actually derives directly from what I learned from the great master. So I'll start with a timeline. And in order to do the timeline, I'll get everybody coordinated as to where we are. So this is a picture today of Cambridge with MIT obviously identified. And just to get you coordinated, this is, of course, the Landau building. In 1976, there was a different layout, because now Tech Square was actually a Polaroid facility. There was a warehouse and sort of a lab there. And for me, I was just in the stages of my new career. Actually not new. I drove a truck for about 6 years and put myself through college. And when I got a degree in mathematics, I was smart enough not to try to pursue pure mathematics. Very smart. But in the summer of '76, this was me in my career. I was a truck driver in Boston. And the good news was that I was picking up Polaroid. And coming by Polaroid, I noticed there was this institution over here. And the good news was, with a degree in mathematics, the first building I walked in was the new Landau building. It had been open for about 2 months, and I applied. And somehow, I got in. I'll tell you in a little bit. No degree in the field, and I will tell you it was Glenn Williams, who was Director of Graduate Studies. So I matriculated in February. I came in the middle of the year. I was at a cycle. This wasn't planned. And with no degree in the background, what courses could I take? Well, it turns out I was qualified to take polymer courses. And we haven't seen a picture of this man yet, but Ed Merrill was an absolutely wonderful guy who was teaching 10.691, and the other course was taught by 10.67. And I have 2 quotes. The one was from Merrill that semester in the spring. I'll never forget one day. He got very exercised at me. I didn't know much. I pestered him about everything. Bates, you're like a bulldog with a bone. And the next quote from Bob came later in my career, but I'm going to put it up now. There was a point, you know, Bob, you and I never always saw eye to eye and how things went. But Bob gave me a lot of rope. And that rope led me to almost hurt myself. At one point, Bob told me, Frank, you got to reach back and find the fastball. If you remember that. That had a big impact on me. So in May of '77, I was looking for something to do. I didn't realize that you actually had to find an advisor. I was new to this. But he said, fine, you can join my lab. I joined this lab and went in the lab to work initially with Alonzo Ramos, who's here. Alonzo, where are you sitting? Back over here. And went in the lab, and Alonzo, I found this lovely picture. This machine called the Ria Vibron. Nobody would name their machine that. But this instrument was the most primitive but first mechanical spectrometer. It operated with 4 frequencies. If I recall, 11 was actually resonant with the machines. You could Alonzo, when I saw you were coming, I had to focus in on this. You had to run this machine, and Mike, I know you did this too. You had to sit there, pour liquid nitrogen in. The machine would heat by just natural heating, and you would sit and you would dial the strain. You would balance a Lisa Jus figure on an oscilloscope with the, mechanically, you tap the dial, because the meter actually stuck. You had to tap it. You would read tan delta quickly, write down the number, switch to another frequency. I'll show you, I took a lot of data from my thesis with this. But that summer, Alonzo, and I say I, because I actually had no idea what I was doing, produced a paper that was submitted September 6th, and this paper was on the importance of the massa correction. And Alonzo, you left very shortly after that, went on your postdoc to Strasbourg. Here's a key figure from this paper. These are data that have been shifted vertically for clarity. And I want you to note, these are the uncorrected data, and these are the corrected data. Can you imagine Bob's tenure turned on that important correction to those data? Oh my gosh. In May '78, I passed the qualifying exams. I'm in the business now. I have no idea how that happened. And then I started on my real research work. Chris was Chris Schweer. Chris Schweer joined in the fall of '78. And we went on to do a lot of work. I defended my thesis in '82. Here's a picture of my thesis signed with ink. Glenn Williams was the director of grad studies who let me into MIT. Actually, his secretary let me in.
Eleanor Keogh.
Eleanor Keogh, when I walked in the building, I said, can I apply here? I had a rather unconventional shirt on. She says, have you been to college? I said, yes. She said, well, we'll have to get an interview for you with Professor Williams. The next day I showed up equally absurdly dressed in a three-piece, ill-fitting suit. They let me in. Okay, I'm going to give you two short scientific vignettes that couple back to my thesis. The first has to do, and both of these have to do with spherical structures, which was really the basis of my thesis. In 1979, you brought a guy in the lab, Polish guy who did his thesis work in France with Dijon. In 1979, Ludwig Leibler visited the lab, and I met him. I've been good friends with him for many years as a consequence. The next year, he wrote the most important paper probably ever in the field of block polymers. He wrote the first self-consistent field theory, which explains why theoretically these materials order the way they do. And in there embedded was the prediction that the spherical morphologies would go BCC. In 1982, we published a paper out of the work that was in my thesis with Chuck Burney, where we did small angle neutron scattering, electron microscopy. These images were taken from a Philips 100 microscope on the 4th or 5th floor of the building. This was the original Philips electron microscope. Who worked on that? Unbelievable. You took the thing apart mechanically, camera, balanced everything. Look at the quality of those pictures though. And I learned how to do the staining and the microtoning initially from Alonzo. And this was the first time that body-centered cubic spheres were actually verified experimentally. A couple of years ago, still doing the same old thing, diblock copolymers, we had the good fortune of discovering with my student Sang-Woo Lee, who's now a professor at RPI, discovering this remarkable new sphere-forming phase. I'm not going to dwell on the details. What I want to emphasize is that this work then led to a paper that was just published last week, which shows not only do you make body-centered cubic packing, but you can make this complicated packing with 30 particles per unit cell, a Frank-Casper sigma phase, and then we discovered in the last year you can actually make what are called quasi-crystals out of diblock copolymer metals. So there's nothing much new here. I worked on body-centered cubic spheres as a graduate student. I'm still working on it. The other part of my thesis was to work on understanding the mechanical properties of block copolymers, and we initially set out to understand the role that the interfacial mixing played on the dynamic mechanical properties. So we figured out how to make spherical micelles over a range of sphere sizes, did a lot of small angle neutron scattering and testing, but we did a lot of work on that machine called the Reavibron. Here's a piece of data taken from a paper with Professor Argon. And it was always Professor Argon. Professor Argon. It was on my committee. We measured the glass transition temperature. I will tell you, every point in this plot was taken with that mechanical assessment. Every point then had to be plotted. We had no plotting routines. We wrote software to do the plotting, to make the plots. All of you old people here will remember how that worked. And out of that data came a plot in the paper in which there was this anomalous TG behavior. There was a sample that, all that matters is that that point did not fit with the correlation in the other plot. And this came out of the paper with Argon and Cohen and myself. And I highlight what was written in the paper, that cavitation in the domains contain low molecular weight rubber, blah, 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 but then whether the proposed failure mechanism has practical implications for the utilization of these materials is open to speculation. So this was in that paper. By happenstance, we had fallen upon the notion that when you supercool this glassy plastic with rubber inclusions, the thermal expansion mismatch leads to hydrostatic tension and cavitation. And that cavitation was then followed up in a beautiful set of papers between Argon, Professor Argon, Cohen, and Schweer. Where's Chris? Chris Schweer is here. Chris worked with these diblock copolymers. This is a very famous picture of this cavitation mechanism leading to toughness and crazing. And then, there's nothing new in the world. About 15 years ago, my colleagues and I started working on putting spherical micelles from diblocks into thermoset epoxies and discovered that these micelles led to extraordinary toughness. The long and the short of it is, this was patented, licensed to Dow Chemical, and in 2007 they marketed a product. They sold the business a year ago, but you can go on the market now and you can buy Fortegra tougheners for thermoset plastics. And just last 2 years ago, in a fundamental piece of work with my student Carmelo Declet Perez and my colleague Lorraine Francis, we were able to demonstrate with small angle X-ray scattering that it's cavitation of these 20 nanometer sized particles that trigger shear yielding that then impart toughness in the thermoset plastics. One of the key citations in this paper goes back to my thesis.
Minus 80 degrees centigrade.
That's right. That's the glass transition temperature of that particular rubbery material. So I point this out because in that work, in order to understand the changes in the particle sizes and the cavitation mechanism, we do detailed synchrotron small angle X-ray scattering, but really we fit data using the same techniques again that go back to the structural paper that we worked on when I was a student. So the main point that I'm trying to make is that my own life has been enriched enormously based on the fundamental science, the approach to science that I learned as a student. And Bob, I'm just going to put this up and I'm going to let you read it. Thank you.
Thank you. If he hadn't been driving that truck, I talked to Glenn Williams. He let you in because you were the driver. If you've been working off the back, no way.
Peter is now, he's the professor of bioengineering at University of Maryland, and he's also the associate dean of engineering school. So Peter.
Yeah, so it's, thank you, Jan. So it's an honor being here and presenting for and celebrating Bob's career. It's also it's good that I follow Frank Bates because I can start with a story. So Frank was showing some papers from 1983. So I started at MIT. I first met Bob orientation week of my freshman year, which was September of 1985. So a couple of years after these papers were published. So I was fresh off the boat, first time in the United States. Right? I had a financial aid package. I needed to find work. So there was this Europe project about neutron scattering, small angle neutron scattering. And this is how I met Bob. So I met with Bob the first time. He started talking to me about neutron scattering and this guy Frank Bates, and I have this data, and SBD1 and Perkusiewicz. This was all Greek to me, by the way, pun intended. But I did manage to do something, and I guess after a year I had my first paper published after the end of my freshman year, and that went on for my graduate work and my PhD. So I really owe everything to Bob. Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to start also with some pictures. I want to show here. Bob knew this. We had this band, for the holiday party. So many of the people in this room, you can see I'm playing the piano. I think it's Jane Sebian. I think is the flute, and you see Steve Spiegelberg there. So we had this band, and we're playing at the annual holiday party of chemical engineering. I don't know if Bob knew that or not, but we were practicing actually in the lab. All these loud people, we were in the lab after hours. I think one time you walked in on us, but you didn't say anything. So that's where we were practicing for this every year. So we had this for several years. So another picture I want to show, this is a bad picture. I'm not a good photographer, but Bob came once for a basketball game, a Maryland basketball game. So I tried to convert him to be a Maryland fan. So here's showing my bad picture skills. Someone took a picture of us with our cell phone. So this is not a good picture, but I have another impromptu picture, which I really love. That's the best picture. And it's, whoever's been in my office has seen it. So this picture is during my graduation. As you know, the way commencement works, the students are sitting down and the faculty pass by. And during my graduation, Bob passed by and I say, "Hey, Bob." So he waved at me and I took a picture. So that was just an impromptu picture during my graduation. It's a great picture, by the way. I have this in my office. Whoever's been to my office has seen that prominently displayed. Also, the key to the lab is also prominently displayed. I got this key in 1985. I kept it until 1996. I don't think anybody had a record of that key, so being checked out. So Bob let me keep the key, so I have it framed in my office together with a picture of Bob. So this is really that's the impromptu photography skills are sometimes they're best than any other setup picture. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to present a couple of recent projects in my lab and show how Bob's work really still influences the work that is done in my lab. So I'm just going to present a few projects that are either published the past year or so, starting with the structural collars. So that's also, Bob has worked a lot on structural collars. So what we have done is we used silica nanoparticles that produce a structural collar, and we've used an enzymatic hydrogel to embed these particles in, and that peptide or enzyme can be broken, and when these bonds break, these particles come closer together. So you can have a specific reaction that is used to make a sensor for some biological entity. So you can go from a red shift to blue shift by the collapse of these particles. So that's, again, influence from Bob's work. This is a type of particle. So these are just silica particles, Stolberg particles. There's a 4-arm PEG norbornene that we've used to link them. And also we have this peptide, CYCK peptide, which is specifically hydrolyzed by chymotrypsin. So only when chymotrypsin attacks this gel will the bonds break, and then we can tailor the composition of the gel, and we can tailor the breaking of these bonds to change color. So we've used this to also create gels that can respond to multiple enzymes, and we did this, logic gates, so we can have trypsin that's not active and chymotrypsin that is active, and we can have combinations of both where both would be active or both would not be active, so we can have this on-off kind of gel just by a structural color and a specific reaction of the enzyme. So another work, again, Bob's influence, we work on point-of-care sensors for various metabolic diseases. So we're looking at several inherent metabolic disorders that can cause a lot of problems in infants. So one that we're looking at is a complication of urea cycle disorder, which is called hyperammonemia, which means there's a lot of ammonia in blood. There is no way to measure blood ammonia in a more portable device, in a point-of-care device. So we came up with this device where we can actually separate small molecules out of blood. Again, it's a colorimetric, this is a colorimetric reaction. It's a very simple reaction. You start with phenol, which is yellow, and then if it reacts with ammonia and hypochlorite, you get indophenol, which is blue. If you do this reaction in blood, obviously blood is deep red and it's got all kinds of stuff, so you can't really see anything. So we wanted a way to separate these ammonia from blood. And what did we use? We used Nafion. So Bob has worked with Nafion and fluorinated polymers for a long time. I actually recently saw a paper with Natick Army people. You've been working with those, with that group since the 80s, I think, early 80s or earlier. So we've used Nafion to separate ammonia and small molecules and have a specific reaction on a two-compartment sensor. On one side, you have pure blood. On the other side is what gets separated, and you get that colorimetric reaction, which can measure levels of ammonia. You can see here what Nafion does. Nafion makes sure that we have a large response and we have no interference with amino acids. So here on this left graph, you can see the response of pure ammonia, and then you can see the response of amino acids. If we did not have the membrane that would separate the reactants from blood, we would have interference from all these amine-containing amino acids, but we were able to minimize that interference and have a specific sensor for ammonia and get a response of ammonia, eventually getting a microfluidic device. So this was turned into a microfluidic device where these components are mixed together, and at the end you get your color going from yellow to blue, depending on different levels of ammonia. And then we have a curve, that's a curve of ammonia measurement in whole blood. So this is with a real patient blood. We can measure from the normal range to a disease range with a very high accuracy in the microfluidic device. So eventually this could turn out into a small cartridge, like is shown here on the upper right corner, and that would give you a true ammonia measurement in your blood, and it would be it's very specific. It's actually better than the mass spec kind of method that is used now in hospital that takes weeks to get results. So you can get results in a few minutes. Another project that I'd like to talk about is we've been looking at sealants and wound closure and using polymer blends instead of conventional suturing. So if we can replace sutures in certain organs that conventional sutures don't work, such as lung, for example, or liver, and if we can replace in also standard surgeries, that would be really, really beneficial for the patient and it would be really beneficial for healing. So, so my student Adam Behrens, who is here in the audience now, he's a postdoc at Bob Langer's group, came to me once with one day with an idea. He said, "Oh, I saw this biomaterials paper where this guy did this for tissue engineering. He did this scaffold with this solution blow spinning technique. And this is great. We can apply this to surgery. We can apply this to different things." So I told Adam, why don't you look at Bob Cohen's work, some time ago. So Bob obviously had worked on this for a different purpose, not on the biomedical purpose. So I know most of you who are faculty, you see your students, they only look at your most recent stuff that's published. They don't know what happened a long time ago. So this is still influenced by Bob Cohen's work. We've used an airbrush to solution blow spin blends of polymers. So the blends that we've used for these surgical sealant is a blend of PEG and PLGA. So the innovation here is that we use a blend composition that melts around 31 degrees C. So when you deposit this on tissue, body temperature is 37 degrees, the PEG melts, and then there's a glass transition from the PLGA, and this sticks better to tissue. So as you deposit these fibers on tissue, they become more adherent on tissue. So this is Adam's work that was published last year in Advanced Materials, and this is blow spinning solution of fibers onto tissue. So we've looked at adhesion, and you can see that the blends at 37 degrees, they adhere much better to tissue than at room temperature because of this transition. There were animal studies. We've done pigs. We've done mice. So you can see a procedure which is called anastomosis. You have two pieces of the intestine that are linked together, and these fibers, this deposition is actually strong enough to hold this anastomosis together, much better than commercial products like T-Seal, Co-Seal. So the PLGA PEG blend, because of this transition at 31 degrees, is able to adhere better to tissue. So all this is very recent work, but the influence of Bob. So I've been a faculty for 20 years at Maryland. So since I left Bob's group, but this is last year's work. I still get influenced by Bob in almost everything I do. So finally, I want to put up this picture. This is a great night I had with Bob. So we had some tickets for the World Series in 2007, and I managed to spend that night with Bob and see the Red Sox win. So that was really an amazing experience. We had a great time, and I hope more things like that will happen. And I'd like to thank you, Bob, for all your mentorship and continued mentorship for all these years. Thank you.
The next speaker is Chris Hooley. So as many of you know, Bob, after he finished his PhD at Caltech, he went to Oxford for his postdoctoral fellowship. And then that's where he met Chris. And then right after Bob got to MIT, I think Chris also moved to MIT to work with Bob. So Chris is one of the first members of the Cohen group. So Chris.
So thank you, Bob, Deon, for inviting me to speak here. I'll put it on now for something completely different because you're not going to hear anything about science or technical. When Deon phoned me up and said, I don't do technical anymore, I don't do science anymore, so is that okay?
Yes.
It's a real pleasure to be here with Bob on this occasion. I'll be speaking in English, if that's okay, rather than... Okay. But it is really from Oxford to Cambridge and back is what I've titled this. And like many of the speakers, it's a bit of a trip down memory lane and a few things about what we did in the past, but also what I have been doing in non-academia in business. And Bob said, please come and talk a bit about business because nobody else will. So I'll give you a flavour of what it is. And did somebody mention this morning about how to be successful in business? If you're surviving, you're successful. And that's really what it feels like. I met Bob in Oxford, and Professor Argon mentioned in the Department of Engineering, I was working with Dr. McCrum, and Bob came over as a postdoc on an ICI fellowship. And this is the less impressive building compared to what we are in here at MIT in the Department of Engineering. And on the right there, can you pick out Bob's second one on the left? In 1972. And we were working on tendons. And there's two people there holding tendons in their hand. And believe it or not. And that's why it was the Tendon Age. And this, to bring back a few memories for Bob. Now, you talked about croquet earlier today, but we had what was called polymer piss-up pub. I don't know whether it translates into American, but that's about every week or so we went out and played darts and bar billiards and things in the pub. So, and on the left there was the John Radcliffe Hospital, where we posed as medics to get into the hospital to get some tendons, but also some free lunches as well. And really, I had to teach Bob what real football was all about, rather than this American football. And that was the game we went to watch Arsenal. He was actually a supporter. He said he was a supporter of Man United, but in those days he was a supporter of Leeds United, who are really non-existent now. So it's a good job he changed his allegiances. And then on the right you see is we've just been to see the Queen and Windsor Castle, and so one of the first selfies with a few. That's Bob's second from the right. And me leaning on his shoulder yet again. Okay, we did actually do some work on science. And it's amazing when you do hand drawings compared to computer ones. That one on the left, top there, when you actually get straight lines through things. It's very easy when you do it. So I have no idea what it means, but these, again, somebody else was saying they did some collections, so it's amazing what you keep. There's these original papers that we actually did together, and then actually worked to get theories around the creep behaviour of tendon. And somebody said to us in Oxford, there's no way you can ever get collagen into skin to actually regenerate tissue and skin. So I wish we hadn't taken any notice of that, because I think we might have made a fortune as people now put collagen into all sorts of things. Okay. And then I came here as a Kennedy Scholar to MIT, and that's Bob working hard as usual at the bottom there. So the t-shirt, I ski. I think it says I ski, doesn't it? Yeah. And there's a couple of other people here. Alonso Ramos on the right, Jim Curler's next to him. We used to call him Big Jim, but he's swamped by the third gentleman. And then there's a new fashion there, I think, on the left. It looks like a skirt of some sort. And when I came here, I had to learn a new language. So the first thing on the left, that green thing, what's that?
Zucchini.
Sorry.
Courgette.
Courgette, very good. The second one, the red thing.
Tomato.
Exactly, tomato.
Usually not,
And then we've got when we came here, my wife Helen, we came and bought a 68 Chevy, and had to learn the terms. The things you put your luggage in at the back there is called a
Trunk.
There are a few things there. And I hope this video works because the previous one didn't, did it? So when I came to Boston, this is the sort of car that we had.
Everywhere we go, over here, over there, where I see a motherfucker, what you say wasn't clear. You never mind what I'm so different, like you said, but it must be a boss that good. I park my car, I'm not your house. Holy fear, we're riding through the hood, and the British are coming, the British are here. Boston!
All the British were here in Boston. Out the can. Okay, and that's Bob introduced me to some new foods there, and the bottom right there, hey, Regina's still going, and we had to go there and get abused verbally by a very old Italian lady. I don't know, I don't think she'll still be there, but and things like Baskin Robbins, coming from the poor England, all those different flavours of ice cream was just heaven, and blueberry pancakes, what amazing things. And Jim and I used to take it in turns on the top left every day going to get the donuts from the MIT reception there. I don't know. And someone mentioned baseball, and really, well, I was here at the 75 World Series, and that's where really I got to know about baseball, and that was according to right now as the second greatest World Series ever played, because we went to the 7th innings. Sorry, 7th game is it?
Yeah.
But on the 6th game, it was in Boston, and the roar went up in the whole city when there was a home run in the end of the 6th game when Boston won that. And actually, this is again something dug out from the archives, and Bob writing there, Chris, were famous because some very in the Patriot Ledger in Quincy. I don't think we were famous, Bob, no. You've become famous since, that's for sure. Okay. People probably know what to say.
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word. Yes, sir. Are you listening? Yes, sir. You. Plastics.
Guess what? I ended up with a career in plastics. I took note of that. So what does a career in plastics look like? Well, I went back to a place called Welling Garden City, working for ICI Plastics. And actually did a bit of science. Bob didn't put me off science completely. So I did a bit of science on ductility of plastics and fracture. And actually, if you got up to the, you needed to make sure that the strength of plastics was ductile in the range 0 to 20, so it wouldn't break in critical applications like in car bumpers and car applications. So I moved into product development, trying to get plastics into cars, and now people take those for granted, but we were working on bumpers and fenders and wheel trims, and somebody mentioned PEEP, the ketone, we were working on that to try and get it into engine components. So that was a very interesting time. And then moved into what was called films, and when you say you're working in films, people get quite interested, thinking it's movies, and then they find it's not really films. But we worked on development in the early days of getting films into banknotes, and so if there's any Canadians here or been to Canada, the banknotes in Canada are now on plastic, on polymer, and that was one of the developments I did in the early 80s. and it's now in 24 countries and 78 denominations. And next year, by the end of this year, the Bank of England will be adopting the £5 and £10 note in the material that was developed there for the company I'm still working with. Okay. And then I moved into sales and marketing, and as we're in Boston, I thought I'd put up a Boston matrix for those who've done any marketing. There's a few MBA people here, so I really won't go into marketing because you know far more about it than I do, that's for sure. But I thought marketing was sales when I first heard about it, and it was in the early 80s. It was amazing how you could go on a one-week course. So ICI sent me on a one-week course in marketing, and then I ended up being a marketing manager the next year. So yeah, I don't think you can do that now. So, but it's all around customer needs and satisfying customer needs. So that's what I've been trying to do. And that Boston matrix, for those who are doing MBAs, it's useless. Well, from our point of view it was. And it's more this matrix, which I think is a McKinsey or GE one, which is looking at business strengths and market attractiveness and trying to plot out your business or product portfolio on that sort of matrix. So you want to be in the top left there. The higher the business unit strength, your business strength, and how attractive the market is. So if you're strong in a business and it's attractive, that's where you want to be. But in real life, then you're not usually in that area. You're actually all over that matrix. And the other thing I learned about marketing, which has been very useful, so in the industry, is to use what's called an OGSM model: objective, goals, strategies and measures. You can use this quite a lot in terms of aligning all the businesses, either from the top business or individual businesses, so everybody knows the objectives, what are the goals, what are those strategies and initiatives that you're trying to get to, and how to measure against that. So that's really all I know about marketing, those two things. And the company I work with is called Innovia Films, and we make biaxially oriented polypropylene films. So you use this process to stretch and blow the polypropylene to get clarity, and then it goes into loads of different applications like food packaging, all the things, the bits you hate in trying to get into packaging products. So that's a range of things on labels that we do. But in terms of marketing and how do you succeed in business these days, the polypropylene business is 7.6 million tons worldwide, an capacity of 75%. Number of suppliers, way many, 100 plus, and 6 out of the top 10 are Chinese. So how do you survive in that sort of area? So the choices in marketing around, well, do you become a specialty producer or a bulk producer? And really for us, then we've gone down the specialty product area, which is a major, that's the only way you can survive against Chinese and other low-cost producers in markets in Asia. So that was the strategy that has been followed, because there's no way you can compete against things like that. We do the ones on the right, not the ones on the left. And again, in packaging, what we need to do is look for the key drivers, and a lot of it is around looking at printing, how to enhance the appearance of the product. Environmental issues are very much something that we have to take into account. But a lot of it is around reducing food waste and getting a reduction, increasing shelf life of products and packaging. And that leads into some issues, and I think this is the only scientific graph I've got so far. We want to move to the left on these. The product's oxygen transmission rate and moisture transmission rate are absolutely key to preserving foodstuffs, and that's we want to get down to that left to enhance the shelf life, and so you can get the products you want fresh in your home. So if you've got any ideas how cost effectively to get plastics more better transmission rates, oxygen and moisture, then we'd certainly like to hear about that. And the other areas on environmental, and then another product we make is cellulose films, which is a bioplastics on the right, and the other one is polypropylene from oil. And one of the dilemmas we've got is if you look at you weigh the things up, like with BOPP films which are from oil, then it's not renewable source, but actually in the process it has a lower carbon footprint than bioplastics films. And at the end of life you can compost bioplastics, but you can't compost oil-based products. So what do you do about that? And the consumer will decide, but it is a very difficult area where, in fact, oil-based plastics actually use less oil in their process for their end of life. Okay. And then product development is key in all of industry, and what we've done is have a development process where we funnel a lot of ideas. Okay. And actually in real life, then we get a life cycle. That's what one product we've been working on the right hand, and on the left hand is what the theory says, so it does actually work. So finally, a few pictures back to Oxford, back to Cambridge again, seeing Bob doing his barbecue tricks there, and then back again to Oxford. He does like Oxford, and watching the rowing there, and they have this amazing thing in Oxford where the aim of the boats is to hit each other, not to actually do anything else.
But apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, the freshwater system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
So really, one of my favourite tips again, what has Bob ever done for us? You've heard a lot of what Bob's done for us. What for me changed the course of my life, got me to MIT as a Carnegie Scholar, helped me get my first job back in England, and really did change the course of my life. So thank you very much, Bob. Thanks for inviting me. All the help over the years, all the memories, all the great times, and the great friendship. So thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Jim Cruiser. Jim was the very first student, PhD student of Bob. Jim graduated with PhD in 1977, working on thermorheological properties of carbon black filled elastomers. He's currently the Skidmore Professor of Chemical Engineering at Purdue University. Jim.
Well, we heard early this morning from Rosanna, who is the Omega student, and I am the Alpha student here. So you've seen the beginning and the end. I'm going to talk a little bit today, first about some technology, and it's technology that my group has continued for the past, now it's been 4 decades, Bob, at Purdue, but it started here at MIT. And then we're going to talk about some remembrances at the end. Although I think Bob and I are probably the only two here that are old enough to have any of these remembrances. But I think I will tell you some things about the early days that may be interesting to some of you. There it goes. This is Bob's first paper at MIT. This is a paper we wrote on cross-linked cis-4,1 polybutadiene, and I'm going to tell you a little bit later how we made this stuff. It will appall you. But we made cis-4,1 polybutadiene, and we continue some experiments that Bob did in Oxford, which were called temperature jump experiments. Let me see if I can get the pointer to work. Yeah. So these are experiments where we took a sample, you put it in a creep rig, and you jump the temperature. And this was the creep response that looked like this. And over here was how we then plotted it up. We looked at the log of the creep rate, and before the temperature jump and after the temperature jump. And if you looked at that 2 ratios and you plotted it over here, you would be able to, for different temperature jump experiments, and that was the sort of data, and we lived with that sort of scatter, you were able to get an activation energy. So that was really the purpose of this whole experiment here. Now, Frank, if you notice how these things are plotted up, that was a plotting routine I wrote for that machine downstairs, which you continued to use when you were here. So, guys, we didn't have this fancy plotting stuff. We had to sort of do it by ourselves. And if you had a really good plot, Bob paid for it over here and had an artist do the drawing. So that's what we did. The experiment we did, let me try to make this work, the instrument is over here. Okay, that is a creep rig, and that was set in Bob's lab, both over in building 12 and then over in building 66. I built the same rig when I went to Purdue. That rig today collects probably the best creep data in the world. It is an incredible device that we built with Bob when we were here. So it still produces, wonderful data. So let me talk about how this sort of start has led to what my group is doing today. This is the second paper we published with Bob, probably about a year later, Rubber Chemistry and Technology, and we worked with an incredibly nice gentleman by the name of Avram Medalia out of Cabot Corporation. And we were talking at that point about this nonlinear creep behavior, okay, and then we were talking about carbon black filled elastomers. And I swore I'd never do that work again. Carbon black filled elastomers is the worst, dirtiest material known to mankind. Sorry for the folks at Goodyear, but it was horrible. And I said I would never do it again. I now have research projects with carbon black filled elastomers, so things come around. But this was an equation in the paper. And so there is a thread of Bob's research which has been mechanics. Most of you guys have listened today to the chemistry part of that, but it started with mechanics. At least half of his work in the early days was mechanics work. And this talks about how the strain response depends in a non-isothermal experiment and is all related to this thing called a clock. And it's a temperature clock here, and that buried at the bottom of that is the log A sub T shift factor that is there. And so this was an equation we used at that time, and Chris and I analyzed a number of non-isothermal experiments when he was over here on the postdoc. Well, what we've done is we've thought about this as we went to Purdue, is that there's really a generalization of this, and it says this A sub T shift factor, how the mobility depends on temperature. Temperature is not the only thing that can change mobility. There's volume, stress, strain, entropy, internal energy, and you come up with a material clock as well, but now this is one that will describe nonlinear viscoelasticity. And it turns out if you look at almost all of the descriptions of nonlinear viscoelasticity, nonlinear viscoplasticity is built on basically this sort of general idea that is here. Experiment, you'd like to describe the whole host of experiments. In fact, describing the full response of the glassy state is one of the outstanding problems of condensed matter physics today. Whoever describes that glassy state will win a Nobel Prize. This is really a pretty big problem. And you'd like to be able to describe like volume relaxation, enthalpy relaxation, this is linear viscoelasticity, nonlinear stress-strain behavior with all sorts of softening and hardening, and then there's a whole host of other experiments which are related to stress relaxation experiments. So you'd like to be able to describe that, and as I said before, the models about this are generally built on using this material clock, where deformation is changing the mobility. And so we built a few years ago one of the models, my group has done this, and we then collaborated with a group at Sandia that was interested in a particular epoxy resin for one of their gizmos that goes boom, and they have it in all sorts of large-scale finite element codes. And this basic idea of a material clock seems to have some of the key features. And so you don't need to worry about all this, except to say there's data, there's the volume relaxation data, and there's a line that goes through it, so that's a prediction using this material clock. Here's stress-strain data. Well, it sort of gets the yield part right, but it doesn't quite get the post-yield behavior correct. It does enthalpy enthalpy relaxation, it can get physical aging, it can get more complex deformation. So this material clock had a pretty good track record. It's doing some things really well. However, when you go on and think about things in much more detail, there's some things it can't describe. It can't get the post-yield softening. And it's not just our model, it's this whole class of models that have gone on for the past 70 years. They can't do all of this, okay? There's something called the tau-effecti paradox, which is a volume relaxation result. There's, again, a whole series of experiments. And the typical approach the community has done for this has been to say, all right, I'm just going to add another function, and I'm adding another function, and I'm adding another function. And it works for that next experiment, but then the next experiment down fails. So it says something is probably wrong at the heart of this. And so about 10 years ago, my group sat down and said, look, maybe we need to back off of this whole problem and think about its source. I mean, what have we really assumed at the bottom? And at the bottom of all these models were two assumptions. One was something I learned from Bob, and it's called time shift invariance, and that's a term that Bob's thesis advisor, Nick Churgle, coined. Okay? And it's really time-temperature superposition. It says the shape of the relaxation function has one shape, and when you change temperature, you move it, but the shape changes the same. If you change deformation, the shape changes, it remains the same. So we assume that in all these models. And the second is, we've always made a continuum postulate, which essentially says we know matter is grainy, is particulate, but we always say, I'm going to average it first, and I'm going to get sort of an average stress and an average displacement and average density, and I'm going to look for relationships among them. And we said, well, maybe we ought to think about that. So what we did, and that should be this is the MIT computer here, that should be just an underbrace there, and that should be an underbrace there. We went back to a model that I learned in my first polymer course from Bob. And this model right here is a Maxwell model. Okay? This says the rate of change of volume is related to volume minus the equilibrium volume over relaxation time, plus a thermal expansion coefficient that's elastic. This is stuff I learned at MIT 40 years ago. And all we did was say, these materials, okay, when you look at the glass, have fluctuations, and it's given the name dynamic heterogeneity. If you're a polymer physicist, it's viewed to be one of the key features of the glass, and it says, when we're in this polymer state, the glassy state, materials don't behave smoothly. There's a nanoscale region here that may have a mobility that's 2 orders of magnitude different than a nanoscale region right next to it. And so maybe this whole idea of the continuum postulate is something that we should question. So there are fluctuations. And so all we've done is we took this simple equation here, which was a single Maxwell element that Bob gave us, and we said we're going to put noise onto it. So it's just a Maxwell model with noise. Now, there's a coefficient here, and you said, well, gee, you have a new coefficient, you can do anything. Well, there's some theorems in continuum mechanics which are just essentially say things must be stationary, okay? That says this coefficient n here is given in terms of this a. So there's a complex relationship, but it's a formal relationship between n and a. So once you specify how the log a shift factor changes, you get n. And there's only one parameter, and that's the domain size. So domain size comes out of this. And notice this is a single relaxation time model. So there's no spectrum. There's none of this stuff of trying to fit what's going on. So it's absolutely the simplest model you can think of. It is just a single Debye process with noise. The noise must satisfy stationarity, and we have one parameter, the domain size. And so that's the basic idea. And notice, 2/3 of that idea were here in 1977 when I started with Bob. And it took me 40 years to sort of say maybe we need to add another term. So this is what we started here. Now, you have to do a little more than that. I can't be that. Okay. That's what I just showed you here. Okay. Turns out that's 1D volume relaxation. You have to move it into a full tensorial form and maintain it thermodynamically consistent. So there was a few more steps and a few more multiple student theses along the way. But basically, I just gave you the idea. All right. So what happened? This is data we took polymethyl methacrylate and compression, and we see the yield response, and this is how when you do sub-TG annealing, the yield curve increases. Literally, none of the other models could ever predict this post-yield softening, okay, without adding an arbitrary new function in. Okay? This model here, without ever building in yield at all, or post-yield softening, predicts the post-yield softening behavior and how does it move with aging time. So it naturally predicts this, it predicts a whole bunch of other phenomena, and why does it do it? Okay? And this is the one part I didn't learn from Bob. Okay? If you look at this model, you have a whole series of domains that are undergoing relaxation, so that you have a distribution of domains, and that's where the distribution of relaxation times comes from. And here's what that distribution looks like during the course of this deformation. So this has to go with this green curve right here. Well, I guess it's the dashed blue curve that we have here. Initially, the distribution starts out very wide. And as the deformation proceeds, what happens is the distribution narrows. And it turns out it's the relaxation of this tail of the distribution over here, which is what gives rise to postural softening. So the whole idea of time temperature superposition and thermorheological simplicity works really well for lots of things, but it doesn't seem to describe the glass. Now, let me go on. So I just showed you one experiment. My group is really working hard on all of this. This is a whole series of experiments: volume relaxation, enthalpy, linear viscoelasticity. This would be the stress strain experiment. We move all the way over to all sorts of nonlinear creep behavior here. So a lot of experiments. And this is a summary of 70 years of continuum mechanics in this particular area of nonlinear elasticity and viscoelasticity. And if the models work, okay, you should not just have a model that describes volume relaxation. Oh, gee, you better describe enthalpy relaxation because this happened at the same time in stress strain behavior. So anytime there's an X in any one of these rows, you should, at that point, absolutely eliminate the model. And so what we're finding right now is that the traditional continuum models here always have X's all over the place. It turns out that putting this little bit of noise in here, to date, we can at least qualitatively describe everything. And so what we're saying is we think that some of the key ideas that I learned 40 years ago with BOPP, okay, are still appropriate, probably provide today the best description of the nonlinear viscoelastic plastic behavior of glassy amorphous materials. So that's what I want to end up with the technical part of my talk. Now I want to transition to the memory part of the talk. So let me just go get one more slide here. Okay, so this just is a summary. This is what we use. We put fluctuations in, and the key physics that we put in here with this is that really what matters is that we don't average first to get how an average rate of relaxation depends upon the average structure of the material. We say the local relaxation depends upon the local structure. It's a very nonlinear relationship. You build your constitutive equation locally, and then you do the averaging. All right, let me just summarize the technical part here. Let me talk what I learned from Bob Cohen. I learned how to do nonlinear creep experiments here, and we built the first rig. Hey, I didn't extend it at all. I copied it. I just used that here. Basic continuum mechanics. Again, I learned that at Bob's feet. All we've added to that has been fluctuations. Linear viscoelasticity. Again, that was Bob's, what was that, 631? Whatever that number. It was 10-6 something that was there. We learned linear viscoelasticity and time temperature superposition there. All we've done is we've made it finite, which is a sort of a straightforward extension. And then what we've said is that the materials are not thermorheologically simple, they're complex. And then with my PhD work, we talked about non-isothermal material clock. And what we've now said is the clock depends on more than deformation. So everything my group has done for 40 years was rooted here at MIT. All right, so now what I want to do, didn't this thing move? There we go. All right, last part of my talk, I want to talk about remembrances, okay? And I know I'm running a little bit over, but I am the eldest son, and there's a few prerogatives that would come with being the eldest son, so I'm going to run over. I'm going to tell you things that none of you guys know about. Okay. I am serious. None of it. Well,
And I'm going to deny everything you said.
Mark Chen, where's Mark? Mark Chen at the back was here with me at the beginning, but that was it. So this is 1973. Okay. First of all, I have to set the stage. Okay. You guys all know Bob as this absolutely distinguished leader of polymer science, outstanding academic at MIT. Didn't start out that way, okay? Bob came here as an assistant professor, okay? Now I gotta tell you what an assistant professor at that time was, okay? MIT was in a transition at that point, and I think at that point, what was it, 1 out of every 2 or maybe 1 out of every 3 people that came in as an assistant professor got tenure. So I mean, it wasn't sort of the way it was today. So it was quite a different field there, okay? We started off in Building 12, okay? Now Building 12 is sort of behind the Great Dome that was there, and it was a low 2-story building, first floor, and then there was a basement, okay? And along the first floor there was an outer ring of offices which were really pretty nice. They had windows, okay? And they had air conditioners, okay? So actually during the summer, it wasn't too bad. Now, nice office there. Now, to be in that office, you had to be a full professor. Now, they had this inner corridor that was sitting in there where they had these itty-bitty little offices, no windows and no air conditioners. That's where they stuffed the assistant professors. So Bob started in this itty-bitty little office in Building 12. And so that's where we started there. And, you know, with the issue of, gee, you know, the history is, you know, 1 out of 3 get tenure. And at that point, if you wanted to be the 1 out of 3, you had to have an MIT PhD, which Bob didn't have. So, you know, bunch of different starting point that was there. So I met Bob he arrived probably what, August of 73? August of 73. At that point, I was a junior at MIT. Okay. Oh, let me tell you one more thing. When they started off at that point, you academics now know about this nice startup package that assistant professors get. Well, what did he have as a startup package? Well, he had no money for graduate students. He was given a lab that was pretty bad, and this office. And that was about it. So this is where we start. Bob's in his office, 1973. I'm actually a chemistry major at that point. A chemistry major. And at that point, I was actually a pre-med student in chemistry. That was the semester I took microbiology, one of those courses where they have a picture of a cell and they got 1,000 names for it. I can't memorize, okay? And so I said I better get a different career. So I went to my advisor, which was Carl Garland. Bob knows him, chemistry professor at MIT, and I said, Professor Garland, I need a different career. What can I do? And at that point, my dad actually is a materials engineer and did some polymer coatings. And I said, what about polymers? And he said, well, chemistry department doesn't have anything in polymers, but Kimmy's hired this new young guy, Bob Cohen. Why don't you go check him out? So I go over to look at Bob, and I had a little bit of concern. MIT undergrads are a little arrogant in their perspective. And so I looked and I said, wow, gee, he's undergraduate degrees from Cornell. Well, that's one strike. I looked at his PhD and it was from Caltech, and I'm sort of thinking, well, you know, that is MIT's West Coast Extension campus, so maybe he's okay. So I said, okay, I'll try this guy out. So I walk into Bob's office, okay, and I introduce myself, and you know, we talk a little bit, but as I introduced and gave him my name, this was one of the few times I ever saw Bob sort of glitch for a second, okay? He sort of, eyes opened, mouth dropped, and he didn't say anything for a little bit. And I'm trying to, I thought, gee, this is just a guy from California, you know. And later he told me, which I didn't know, that when he first saw me, he thought, my goodness, is this the grandson of the great Wallace Hume Carruthers, inventor of nylon, inventor of polyester? You know, he really showed that for the first time polymers were chain molecules. Okay, so I mean, what a Nobel Prize if he not died prematurely. And so I think Bob thought, oh gee, you know, maybe this is MIT is going to work out pretty good. I've got a grandson, you know, he's got good polymer genes in him. He later found out I'm no relation, my name is spelled differently, but Bob was still gracious enough to allow me to sort of work with him in his laboratory. So we started off our project in one of the labs in the little corner back of, again, Building 12 that was there. We started to build apparatus, and the one I showed you was the first one we started to build. Now this is supposed to be a low friction pulley. The first pulley that Bob had sort of put up there, I think was made for truck tires. It had so much friction it wouldn't even turn. But we worked eventually, Bob again by being able to help. We went over to Draper Labs. The gyroscope guys built this a pulley. I mean, it really worked well. So Bob and I built that lab. Now, at that point, Bob had not learned the etiquette that professors learn with students. Okay? Professors own offices, students own labs. Okay? You can walk into the lab as long as you keep your hands in your pocket. Bob hadn't learned that yet. So, on a regular basis, Bob, probably to escape that dungeon of an office that he was in, would put on a white lab coat and he would come walking into the lab. Now, Bob would putter around in that laboratory. I don't think there was ever any research that led to a paper from Bob's puttering that was in that laboratory. He would come in about every second or third day, and he'd putter for a while, and those of us in the lab would sort of sit there and says, when is he going to leave? So he did that. Now, at that point, we were building some apparatus, and I built one that had we had to drop something from about 8 feet up. So I built a little solenoid to let it go off. And one day I come into the lab and I sort of smell a little bit. It smelled like something was burnt. So I waited, okay, and I finally see my solenoid up there was burnt. So finally Bob sort of walks in, sort of apologetically, and he says, well, Jim, I had some visitors here, and I came over and I turned the switch of the solenoid on, but I forgot to turn it off, and I fried my piece. So Bob fried one of my lab experiments, and what I did from then on is I took that piece of molded plastic, okay, and I by a wire, and I hung it right in front of the apparatus. So whenever he walked into the lab, he sort of know where to keep it, where he was supposed to work and not work that was there. So we did that. Now I have to tell you about the about how we made that first paper on polybutadiene, how we made the sheets. Now, chemical hygiene was not a good practice at that point. Now, I don't think that lab had a hood in it. I don't think so, chemical lab. So the way we would make this sheet of material is we would take polybutadiene powder and we would dissolve it in a nice carcinogenic solvent like benzene. Okay? We would take that material and solvent, we would then take a crystallizing dish and we would fill it with 1/4 inch of mercury in the bottom of it. And then we would take that mercury dish, put it in the bottom of a lab drawer, not in a hood, just in the bottom of a lab drawer, fill it with that polybutadiene with benzene solution in it, and let it evaporate. And Bob would go back to his office and let us practice. Now, what happened after that was even worse, okay? You now finally, it evaporates down, you have a nice smooth film. You now have to take an X-Acto knife and cut it away from the surface. And so you can pick up your film, but left to the edge is this sort of polymer encased with mercury bubbles all over the place. Okay? And so what you do is, well, okay, you throw that in the trash can. And then the mercury went on the floor, you'd sort of sweep it up under the desk. So now I want you to know that we finally left building 12. They come over here. And I believe it was the next occupant of that lab, maybe the second one, the next occupant of that lab was the MIT psychiatric unit. So I think it may have been the fumes and the mercury over there, sort of left. So that was what how we started in building 12. Eventually we moved to building 66. And we thought those were absolutely palatial surroundings. Those are really cool. But you guys, again, don't realize what the campus was at that time. Okay? Building 66 was on the fringe of campus. And then you headed towards Kendall Square. Okay? Now, I took a bus home every night from the MTA station at Kendall Square up to Arlington, which is where I lived. There were a lot of nights I'm sitting there saying, I hope that bus comes really quickly. And there were an awful lot of really pretty scary characters that were hanging around in Kendall Square. So it was a pretty nasty place that was there. Okay? We were at the edge of campus, that was where we called them the street urchins. They were the sort of younger homeless folks of Cambridge would come in to MIT and they'd run the tunnels at night. And so, now granted, we didn't have computers then, we had typewriters, okay? But the typewriters all had to have a bolt about this big that were attaching them to the desk, otherwise they would leave at night from the street urchins. So this was a pretty rough environment that we were out there. So we started to move lab, the lab got built. Now Bob still started to come into the lab. Now at that point he had jettisoned the lab coat. Okay? So he just came in normal street clothes. So there was no pretense anymore that there was going to be experiments that were going to be done. But at this point, Bob starts to worry about tenure. Now, he may have been worrying earlier, but you can all start seeing the tenure clock starting to worry. And he starts to worry about papers. And so one time I had, the first set of data, and I showed Bob some preliminary data. And 3 days later, there's an abstract, there's an introduction, there's a beginning part of a paper. I'm saying, Bob, where's the data? So he was writing papers as we were doing the experiment. So Bob did that. Now I did do one thing, and Bob probably doesn't remember this, but at times I was a little, I would poke him a little bit. As you know, Bob is colorblind, and he's in the lab, and he's looking around, and if you would leave a piece of interesting data out on your desk, okay, he would look at it and he'd say, oh gee, where's this paper coming out of this? But if you made of green and blue your symbols on there, he couldn't tell what it was. And so, he'd be very politely, kindly, he wouldn't say anything. He'd come in the next day, Jim, we got some interesting data. Oh, maybe in a bit. So Bob would kindly walk out, and you play this game for 4 or 5 days before you would finally say, all right, Bob, I'll show you the data that we had. So, last couple of issues. Chris came, okay? We had a great time with Chris Hooley in the lab. That was wonderful. But I always had great fear at that point because Bob and Chris kept having this conversation about wanting to do more measurements of tendons. And I'm thinking, what are these two guys going to do? I mean, it's my creep apparatus, okay? And are they going to be out trolling the morgues in town trying to, get a tendon or something to put into their apparatus? So, the last thing I want to do is I want to come back to this. Now we see that Bob Armstrong and Bob Cohen there. Now, first of all, as Frank and I have talked, at this point neither one of them had a clue how to push any of those buttons to measure. Now, but I do want you to notice a little bit about the hairdo. Now, Bob Armstrong there has hair. Well, there may be a comb over, but they're gone. But you look at Bob there, Bob Cohen there, and if you notice something about his hair, which is different than what most of you know, it's dark. Most of you think of Bob as this absolutely distinguished academic with this great piece of white hair. And so, how did it get that? How did it change? How did it change so early? Well, perhaps it was the mercury back in building 12 that was causing the problem there. Okay? Probably more likely, it was his first graduate student that didn't take direction real well. Probably he had a choice. He either pulls it out and looks like Armstrong, or he looks like but it was only partly white, gray, when I left. However, following me very quickly was Frank Bates. Frank and I overlapped by several months. How can I describe Frank? I mean, you guys all know him as this absolute pillar of polymer science, an incredible debonair individual. And I've been thinking about what word I would use to describe Frank when he first arrived. And I think the only word I could come up with was wild man. A little crazy. And he'd been there about a month or so in the lab, and Bob sort of walks up to me and he says, Jim, what do you think about this Bates guy? And I said, I think he'll work out all right. Give him a chance. So Frank, yo. So those were some things about the early days of Bob. Quite different. I mean, things go back 40 years. Life is quite different. But I will tell all of you this from the beginning, from the absolute day that I met Bob, he was an absolute incredible teacher. I mean, and it was not teaching just about polymer science, but it was teaching this enthusiasm of what it is like to discover and do research and learn things. And that was there from the beginning. From the beginning, Bob has had this incredible ability to mentor. He's always been able to look at a student, somebody like me, okay, who came in with lots of rough edges, lots of angular pieces, and says, what are the God-given talents that this young person has, and be able to say, I'm going to help amplify those, and then I'll file off a little bit of the rough edges that were there. So he has always been able to do this. So, Bob, I'm going to speak now. I'm going to take the prerogative of the eldest son to speak not just for myself, but for all of us. That is, Bob, you have been an absolutely great, incredible teacher. We could not have asked for anyone to be a better mentor. And you've been a friend. I don't know what words can describe what we want. The only word I can come up, and it's totally inadequate, is thank you. Friends, Bob Cohen.
Thank you. That's the operative word. I'm really overwhelmed. It's been just spectacular. Some of the things you heard about today are true, and even the things that weren't true are pretty. I thought that I knew you guys a little bit, but some of the performances here today are different from the personality disorders that I thought you guys had. I have to tell you, this has really been an education, and I would love to cycle back and start all over because I would maybe do some things a little better. So let me see if I can get through some of this. So thank you, Alina and her team. They're not here, but you've been interacting with her. They put a lot of work into this for me and for all of us, and she had a group of people, Sandra and Alina were the sort of leads on the team, Melanie, Rebecca. Rebecca made this fantastic website. I see a camera up there. Is there going to be a film of this? And I'll explain to you how you can post some of your pictures and everything, but that was all Rebecca's doing, Greg, Barbara. Now, the rascals that organized this thing, the truth is it's not my birthday. It's not a retirement party. It's not a wake. I'm standing What is it then? I guess it's a family reunion, right? We're all a big family, and that's what makes me so happy is that you guys have all come to see each other and to be with each other, and we're all part of a big family, and I think that's terrific. But Dayon and Frank, you've heard. I think Frank imposed his will a little bit, and he had a framework for this, and Dayon did all of the sort of nitty-gritty work. I can't thank you two enough. I think Peter and Paul and Robbie were part of the instigators, maybe wrestled with the chemistry department a little bit, and so on. And there are probably others that I don't know about. So whoever was involved in this whole organization, thank you very much. I thank Paula and the chemistry department for, you've been here all day, giving up a whole day of your busy schedule. Klaus, before Paula was approached to, do this, and I can't thank you in the department enough for allowing this to happen. And obviously I want to thank all of you, the speakers. I just mentioned you were spectacular in the creativity. And the attendees sitting through here this whole day, it's just made me feel just terrific. So I was going to do the aw shucks and just sort of shuffle out, but I decided I might have a couple of things I want to say. But before I go to that, this is, for those of you who haven't seen, this is Rebecca's website. You can't post things on it directly. You have to send it to her through that email address, and then she'll post it for you. And it's kind of fun to look at what's been posted already. I think maybe I asked her if she's going to leave it, live, and she said it'll stay up there as long as you want it to be. So send your pictures and your comments and your criticisms and your thoughts, and we can all read about each other. The family tree can stay together in that way for a long time in the future. So here's the outline of my talk. The practice school always says you should have an outline. I won't spend a lot of time on any of these particular things, but there are things that I just want to say a word or two about. The first one is competing at the highest level. Now, I want you to be sure, I'm not saying succeeding at the highest level. I'm talking about competing at the highest level. There's a difference, and why that's important to me. I'll talk a little bit about MIT faculty style. Ali, your name might come up in this a little bit. Then there's this sort of, sounds like a 4-year-old would say, what's good for me, gimme, gimme, gimme. What's good for me is good for MIT. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. Item 4 is balance, collaboration. Ali, your name will come up again. And then 2 seconds on maybe if, you know, what am I proud of? What do I think I may have done over these years at MIT? So competing at the highest level. I think people spend their lives trying to figure out, you know, who are they? How do I fit in? Where do I stand? And I think, you know, a more sophisticated person might, you know, deal with it philosophically or for me, it was very simple. You compete, you win, you lose, and you sort of see where you stand. It's a very simplistic approach, but it works for me. And then if you're built that way, then all you really want is a chance to compete at a very high level. If you have that chance, then you know kind of where you stand. Well, when I graduated from high school, back in 1964, I was pretty sure I hadn't been competing at the highest level. I had no real sense of who I was, but I was very lucky. Oh, I see. Of course, this is the pointer. I came from this part of the world, which was, yes, interesting from the point of view that there was oil there and chemical engineering heritage and so on. But this place, Cornell University, back in the 1960s, had something called regional scholarships. They had the country divided up into little sectors. This piece of the world was one of those sectors. If you got into Cornell from one of those sectors, you had a chance to compete for one of these regional scholarships. Well, I don't think anybody from this hillbilly part of the world had gotten into Cornell in years and years. When I got admitted, I got that regional scholarship, and that made a huge difference in my life. So coming from Oil City had its advantages. And then I think you can see, we're talking about connecting the dots. 1964, it's more than 50 years I've been sloshing around in these incredible high-level places. And I've been competing, and you know, I have no illusions. I think I have a good sense now of where I stand in places like this, and it's very nice to be able to say that I've been invited into these incredible places. Cornell, PhD at Caltech, the fantastic postdoc at Oxford, and then 40-some years here at MIT. The nice thing about places that are so exceptional, I'm struggling up here, but I'll get it, is that they introduce you to even more interesting places, and then doors open for you again. At Cornell, I went into an office. I was looking for a summer internship. Some woman, I wish I remember who it was, said, well, we have these overseas things. And I got a job at Dow Chemical Company in this godforsaken part of southern Holland. I learned important things about distillation and so on. I also learned that if you come from Pennsylvania, football, is a big thing. I learned that football is actually played with a spear. It had a big influence on my life. I learned things about Europe. I still love Europe to this day. That all came from somebody at Cornell that helped me out and got me a summer job. Then I worked for a big, important company like Dow a second year in a row. And you learn that these big institutions are also families of people that care about each other, compete with each other, and are interested in making their enterprise a success. At MIT, I can't list all the things, but certainly my interactions as a consultant, the reason Goodyear wanted me to consult there is not because of me, but because I came from MIT. The opportunity that Adele talked about, I think you give me way too much credit. I might have insisted on some stock options if I actually did what you I got to interact with people at DuPont in a very detailed way, and I had visits and leaves and sabbaticals in some spectacular places that I've been able to enjoy. And again, to operate and compete and measure myself against people at the highest level, it's just been a joy to be able to do that. And for me, it's been important to get a sense of who I am. In these places, you meet exceptional people. Nick's name came up a couple of times during the day. This is my thesis advisor, Nick Churgle at Caltech. This is an amazing guy. I idolized him when I was a graduate student. I hung on his every word. This guy was incredible. Talked about the Second World War, escaping the Nazis, running from the Russians. He finally was driven out of Hungary with the 1950 invasion when the tanks rolled into Budapest. He went to Australia, he got a PhD. He was 45 or something years old, and he ended up in professorship at Caltech. I was his second or third student. He was an unbelievable person, but he really appreciated someone who would listen to him. And I was matched up with him perfectly. I was so enthralled by the things he had to say, and he was pretty enthralled with the idea that I'd like to listen to what he had to say. But the thing that I want to emphasize about Nick is, if you were in his group, if you were a member of his team, that was his operative word. He says, I work for you. What do you need? What do you want? What can help further your education? He wanted us to learn things, but more than that, he wanted us to enjoy the process of learning. And that was a terrific thing that Nick taught me. And this way of looking at things, you're on my team, I'm going to work for you. I think that was something that definitely stuck with me. After leaving Nick, I went to Oxford, and I worked for this guy, whose name was also mentioned.
Might just need to point it at the computer.
Oh, there you go. I worked for this guy. This is Jerry McCrum. He was Nick Turtle to the -1. You notice what I say on me. He said, Cohen, you work for me. He tells the story a little differently than the way I remember it. He took over. Well, this kid was a junior, not even a graduate student. He said, here's what we're going to do, Bob. And he gave me a timeline. I'm going to get out of here in 6 years. He had the whole thing mapped out. So I ended up working for him. And we made a lot of music together. And I think that moving in this direction was partly because of Jim, partly because of Nick, but maybe this will work. Really because of these people. These are my parents, Minnie and Dave. They are who they are. There they are. They grew up in they came through the Depression, the Second World War. By the time they were ready for things, time had passed, and so they didn't go to college. They put their energies in somebody used the word vicarious pleasures into their children. And so I learned a lot of things from my parents, but what I really learned is that you can genuinely get pleasure, enjoyment, tremendous gratification from the success of other people, particularly if you put something into those people's lives. And I think if you're connecting dots, if I ever did anything for you, the connection goes back to these two guys. So how about this 4-year-old? What's good for me is good for MIT. What do I mean by that? I literally, and less so now because I don't need much, but for the first 35 years of my life here at MIT, I really believed this. If you give it to me, you've made good use of whatever it is. But I didn't really make that up. I learned it from this guy, Ray Bedore, who's had a big influence on my life. He was department head when I was hired here. Larry Evans, who I see was his executive officer, they actually had a plan for hiring people from outside of MIT. It was my good fortune that I came through the system in that time. But Ray said to me, look, Bob, I hired you, so what's good for you is good for MIT. Why? Because if you look good, I look good. If I look good, the chemical engineering department looks good. If it looks good, then MIT, and so on and so on. And I guess this is maybe something he was trying to tell me, that self-interest doesn't necessarily have to be selfishness. And I think the important thing that comes out of this view of things is that it's a kind of bottom-up agenda. Give stuff to people in the trenches, good things will happen, and the agenda takes its own form. I'll be a little politically incorrect maybe now, but I think at MIT, the opposite message is at least sometimes in the air. What's good for MIT is good for you. And that kind of bottom up is flipped over, and we have a top-down agenda. We have a lot of times where resources come in and then they flow down into the system, but the agenda is set in a different way from this way of looking at things. Ray, I just have to say another two things about Ray. He founded an unbelievably huge company, Amgen Corporation, with 3 other guys, so he's a gazillionaire. He also founded a second company with me. It's a little company. It's not Amgen. It's called MadTech Corporation, but I'm very proud of that. It's a company, 50, 75 people get up every day and they go to work, and they go to work based on some patents that were developed on the 3rd floor of Building 66, so it's a very gratifying thing. Ray basically raised the money to build Building 66 when he was department head. We've exploded it and renovated it, and lots of things have happened since then. But we all in chemical engineering owe Ray a lot, and personally I do as well. But I'm happy that he taught me this way of looking at things. It worked for me, and I hope it remains, that kind of view remains in the agenda of MIT in the future. So, balance. What do I mean by that? People often ask me, what's the most difficult thing? What's the hardest problem you've ever tried to solve while you were at MIT? And the hardest problem I've ever tried to solve at MIT is how do you find balance between personal life and professional life? MIT will take everything from you if you let it. And most people like us in the room would like to let it. We're passionate about what we do. So when I say balance, there's this balance between family and work. And how do you find that balance? I don't have any answer. But I'm grateful for the fact that I've had to deal with the problem. I've had to deal with the problem because I have a family. I have a wonderful family. They're sitting up here. I'm going to get a little emotional, I'm afraid. They're sitting up here. This picture, why did I pick this picture? It's not even, this blockhead here is Elliot. That's Jenny, Bob, and Jane. This picture was taken in 87, maybe just in the winter of 87. It's been in my wallet ever since. I've changed wallets probably 30 times, but I've never been able to toss that picture away. I don't know why. It's just something that says we're a family. This is the balance against which I struggled, with the thing with MIT. Families change. Those 2 kids grew up into nice young adults. They then match up themselves. Here is Jenny, my daughter, with her fiancé, Justin. You guys want to raise your hands up there? Jenny and Justin. They've come out from Seattle to be here, and thanks for doing that. There's Elliot with his wife, Jacqueline. They got married last summer. Elliot and Jacqueline, thanks for being here. They live in Boston. Elliot's a real Boston guy, and Jacqueline's born and raised in Boston as well. And then, of course, the person that I owe everything to is Jane, sitting up there. Any sense that I succeeded in finding any balance, I owe to Jane. In a different way from the way my parents supported me, Jane insisted that I look at things for what they really are and behave in a way that was a balanced a way of dealing with life. Jane, I love you. You're the best, and thank you for helping me all these years to struggle with this question of balance. So I thought this was the perfect place to put Allie's picture up there because it kind of will help me settle down. So look at this guy. I didn't pick this picture. That's the one you have on the mechanical engineering website. But I think that says a lot. Allie is a very, very discriminating, tough guy, wants excellence, demands it. We collaborated, as Allie said, fantastically for nearly a quarter of a century. It was just an amazing collaboration. I'm sorry that we don't do it on a day-to-day basis now. Some of these numbers, Allie's in the mechanical engineering department. That's my count of the number of papers and conference proceedings that we published together. The highest cited paper is 335 citations, and it's growing. Jonathan, are you here? That's not your paper, but you're like 1 or 2 sites behind Bartzuk, and you just keep moving together in there. But and our first paper, we started in the 70s, but our first paper was published in '81, and we finally published our last paper together in 2004. Fantastic, Ali. I loved our time working together, and it's a treasure. It always will be. Our style was. Let me say this. We were kind of good cop, bad cop with our students. Take a look at the picture and tell me I'm almost done. I'm not going to give you too much more. This is Dick Schrock. Dick Schrock in the chemistry department. It's a great joy to me that I marched across the campus with chemical engineering students. Dick didn't think chemical engineering students could possibly make a contribution. He wanted to work in the polymer area for a while. He sought me out. We worked together. We had a great collaboration together. It was not that long, just a few years. We published 22 papers together. But look at that number, 170. Those are probably the 22 lowest cited papers in the whole resume of Dick Schrock's publication. Dick Schrock's a Nobel laureate. I'm sure he's got papers that have been cited 5,000 times or something like that. But I really enjoyed working with Dick, and the pleasure for me is that, Gordon, you're here. I don't know if any other Schrock Cohen students are here, but he bought into the fact that chemical engineering students were spectacularly good, and in some cases outstripped the behavior and the performance of his chemistry students. I have 2 collaborations that are ongoing still. They're if I come in the morning and I see Gareth on my calendar or Mike Rubner on my calendar, it's a good day. I love meeting with these 2 guys. The thing that somebody said, I guess it was Chris, I'm going to speak English. There's something about Gareth, it doesn't matter what he says, he just sounds like he's right.
This is very
He said something earlier. He said, all roughness is not created equal. Did you say it? He said, it sounds reasonable. When I say it, it sounds like I'm misquoting Lincoln. You say it, it sounds scientifically elegant. Nevertheless, I'm a little jealous. We've gone just up to 38 papers and conference proceedings. But that's my world record. Our science paper's been cited now nearly well over 1,000 times. We started in 2004 and we're continuing. And Michael, there's no good cop, bad cop here. There's no way you could be as good as Michael with students. He's the best. We've had a really nice run together. Our hydrophobicity paper's been cited 650 times and running. Is Lay here? Did he leave? Oh yeah, he had to leave, but he was here, the leading author of that. We started in 1998 and we're still going, and we have some good things going on in the lab. But for me, there's no doubt in my mind at all that some of the success that I've had, some of the awards that were mentioned, you guys here in the corners of this thing are in many ways largely responsible for some of the good things that have come my way. And it's been a joy, the collaboration. One nice thing about collaborating at MIT, of course, is that we're not forced to do it. Somebody, I think Ali said, that people bring something to the table. And if there's synergism, then the collaboration goes on. If there's no synergism, there's no need to collaborate. And the fact that I've had these 4 collaborations has been a great joy over the years at MIT. So what have I done? What do I think has been worthwhile? I'll list a few things, and you can decide. That polymer science lab that I started in 1973, Jim talked about it. Rick is one of the few people in the room that has actually taken that lab because it's an undergraduate class. I'm proud of that. That class has been taught for whatever I can't subtract, but it's been taught for over 40 years. Probably over 1,000 students have gone to that lab. It's an elective. It's been very successful. I think I was probably hired because of this polymer science lab, not because of my research. I came here to interview. I had mentioned that I developed the polymer science lab as a TA at Caltech. Ray Bedour, who was the department head, said, I'm going to run this by our visiting committee. Paul Flory's on the visiting committee. Flory said, hire the guy. If he wants to run a lab for teaching in polymers, just go ahead and hire him. So that's been a success, I think. I'm extremely, everybody knows this, that I think that PPST or PPSM is just the greatest thing on earth. And I'm so pleased about that polymer program that started in 1985. Pleased because people like Paula came out of that, Dan, Gareth, Michelle's in the room. Other people, if I'm forgetting you, if you're here, oh, Anush. Well, I'm not going to say what I was going to say. I am proud of the polymer program, again, largely because of the people who have come through it, and it's been a success. We sued. Were you in PPSM? Very good. And Peter, of course, that's right.
Or who?
Or who? In fact, the whole room's full of PPSM people. That makes me feel even better. That's unbelievable. So that's something I'm proud of. The PhD CEP program that Rosanna told you about, I'm proud of that. It's a newer program. It's a very small program. It's very specialized. But I'll be honest, I think if that program existed and I was a student, I think that's what I would do today. The combination of business and science seems very, very relevant. Both of my kids have MBAs. I envy them. I wish I had an MBA. I think there are things in there I would enjoy learning and dealing with. I mentioned already, I'm proud of the fact that MadTech exists and people have jobs because of it. I wish it would suddenly explode and go public. I would retire instantly and move to Bermuda or something fantastic. But I am pleased that something out of the third floor lab has a real embodiment. You can, knock on the door and walk into the labs. They're out in Ashland, Massachusetts. This made the list, Rick. I'm really and we're coming down to Princeton in the first week of June. I'm very proud of this. It's something different. Rick and I have been meeting with our groups for 20-some years. It's a little competitive, but it's very family-oriented. I wouldn't miss this for the world, and it's something that, well, it made the list, and I'm really happy about it. So one scientific thing, one technical thing. I think that back in 1973, when I came to MIT, chemical engineers did structure property processing studies of polymers. There was a lot of that going on. It was a hot field. But very few, there was one guy, I'll mention him in a second, who actually had the nerve to make his own polymers, to be self-sufficient on the molecular architecture so that the design of structure property experiments could go on in a way that's different from just calling up your friends at Goodyear and begging for a sample. So the guy's name was Bill Grassley, right? I think he was the one. He was working at Northwestern at the time, eventually came to Princeton. And I watched what Bill was doing, and I thought we could do something like that. Plus, I had done some anionic synthesis for my own thesis work. And this is now all about Frank, because Frank walked into my office after driving his truck, and we did have some of all that. That's all true to the last word, all of those stories, of course. But what is definitely true is that I said, Frank, here's what we're going to do. And we're going to do some synthesis. He liked that idea. He had some chemistry background. He liked the idea of doing anionic polymerization. I said, here's how we're going to do it. He said, no, we're not going to do it that way. He said, we're going to do it in a different way. There are these guys in France, a guy named Paul Remp. They have a way of doing this in scale and using Schlenk lines and argon overpressure. I won't go into the details. All you need to do is buy me a ticket to Paris. I'll get to Strasbourg, and then I'll learn how to do it the right way, not the way you have in mind. So I am proud of the fact that I wanted to do this kind of work, and it was a hallmark of the early days of our lab. But Frank took it to new levels, started me off in the right way, and then, of course, his career has just been ballistic with his self-sufficiency. This really applies to Frank and his team in Minnesota and the kind of things they did with that. But we got started here, and it was great to do that together. But what am I most proud of? Well, you know the answer. I'm proud of this. I'm proud of this assembly, this family that has spent the day with me here today. It's been spectacular. I think you can tell it's meant a lot to me. And the other things I said, 1973 to the present, I believe that there's no need to put an end on this. And I'm not saying I'm going to live forever or anything like that. But, you know, we're a tree, and the branches and the roots and everything, I think this just goes on and on. So what am I proud of? This whole thing that I call Cohen Group. There's the website. You can look at it, and let's just stay in touch. I always say the same thing to people when they graduate, when they leave. I say the only thing that will make me angry is if you don't keep in touch with me. If you write to me, I'll write back. I'm always happy. You know, I'm my parents' kid, so your accomplishments, your achievements are my achievements, and I enjoy hearing about them. But I think some of you have written to me with the opposite side of things, and I'm happy to write back. I don't mind being a shoulder to cry on if that's what you want to do. But just stay in touch, keep up the good work, and obviously the way I want to end is to say thank you very much.